So hello everyone, good morning. Welcome to our second Brout Queer Day. It is a pleasure to be here, and it's a great initiative that we have been working on this for some time. And would like to read some of the comments we have been reading and what made us create an event like this. It's just it's just my opinion. This gender neutral language thing is a waste of time. My comment was solid, and you showed lack of knowledge to debate and use the ban power. If I blocked him, I've had my reasons. Why did the word become so boring? So these are some of the comments we've read as Brout moderators, or comments that people have sent us privately. And as moderators, we try to make sure that the terms of use are respected and that members abide by them. After all, the terms of use were created by Brout members collaboratively. And our terms, they state that discriminatory content is not tolerated, prejudice is not tolerated, bigotry is not tolerated. It seems not only Brazil, but the world has been affected by this conservative way. Rights that had been long established now seem to be questioned. And we, as Brout moderators, gladly donate our time and effort to the Brazilian EOT community. We wonder how to deal with sensitive and sometimes taboo topics. Do we allow teachers to voice their opinions? Yes, we do, provided that those opinions are not prejudiced. So we start our second Brout Queer Day because we believe it is of paramount importance to equip teachers to deal with LGBT plus realities, to listen to LGBT plus teachers and their experiences, but also as a way to reinforce that Brout community is not a place where hate is tolerated. We exist and we resist. And to start this wonderful day, we have the pleasure of having Scott Thornbury as our plenary speaker. Scott is a teacher trainer with over 30 years experience in English language teaching and an MA from the University of Reading. Thank you so much for being here, Scott. It's such an amazing opportunity for people in Brazil to be listening to you, and we thank you for donating your time and some of your knowledge for us here in Brazil. And he's going to be talking about gay is a global issue. So over to you, Scott.
Thank you, Bruno, and thank you so much for expediting this, and congratulations, in fact, for expediting this as the second of two, I think, landmark occasions. So I know nothing in my history where there's been a whole day dedicated to queer issues in ELT. So well done, all of you. I'm speaking from Spain at the moment, and I'll be picking up on that theme in a second. I'm going to switch over to the presentation in a second too. Then Bruno's going to field or save any questions that you have, and then we'll allow some time towards the end for a bit of question and answer, and I will reappear, hopefully, if I can get my head around the technology. Can you hear me okay, Bruno?
Yes, yes.
Okay, great. So I'm going to switch over to the presentation now, and you should see it. Okay, is that visible, yeah. Bruno?
Mm-hmm.
Great, okay. Just a little bit of background to the title. It's very appropriate for a start that today is International Human Rights Day. I didn't know that when I was planning this presentation. In fact, I only discovered that this morning. But it's very appropriate for the theme, in a sense, of what I want to talk about. This presentation grew out of a workshop I ran 2 years ago at the IATEFL conference in the UK, in Manchester. And I don't know how many of you know of the structure of IATEFL organization, but there are what are called special interest groups, SIGs, and they have a whole day devoted to workshops in advance of the convention. And I was invited to lead a workshop for the global issues special interest group. And as it's obvious, global issues deals with things that are of global importance and tend to be issues of social justice. And they asked me if I would run a workshop, a day-long workshop, on any theme I chose. And a little bit of investigation showed that never in the history of this special interest group had they dealt with LGBT issues. So it seemed to be appropriate that I devote the workshop to LGBT issues and ask the question, is gay a global issue? Because, you know, why hasn't it been dealt with in a group which is dedicated to global issues? And I mean, there's all sorts of reasons, and clearly you could argue that there are more important things to be talking about than LGBT issues. That is to say, there are issues that affect a wider range and a greater number of people. For example, climate change, human trafficking, etc. But it did seem unusual that a group that was dedicated to social justice should have, in a sense, ignored LGBT issues. But anyway, we did it. It was a great day. There were about 20, I guess, participants from a wide range of contexts, including an academic from Libya, another Libyan woman working in the UK, people from Scandinavian countries, from Latin America, from Britain itself, from Israel. And it was a big mix of people, experiences, and opinions. And one of the things, of course, that this brought home is that every context is different. And to talk about a global issue but ignoring the regional and local differences is a little bit over-idealized. So I just want to look at that theme. That's the description of the workshop. But we'll skip that. I think just to reinforce the point that LGBT issues are global issues and are human rights issues. I was gratified to see this just yesterday on the cover of Attitude magazine, the Canadian version anyway. I think the international version, there's a picture of Justin Trudeau and an interview with him. And he says that LGBT+ community has become emblematic for the fight for human rights. So I think that sort of vindicates situating LGBT issues at the heart of human rights. I don't know whether you can see that, but this map of the world reinforces the point that there's a huge range of degrees of tolerance of LGBT people across the world. And you only have to look at Africa, for example, and the Middle East to see how differently tolerated or differently normalized LGBT rights and conditions are. Incidentally, this map comes from the International Lesbian, Gay, Bisexual, Trans and Intersex Association. I'll give you websites and addresses at the end. There's a lot of information here, but it's summarized here. For example, the list of countries where homosexual acts are illegal. 78 countries out of, I don't know how many countries there are in the UN, but less than 200. So that's a fair proportion of countries where people's sexuality is prohibited or manifesting their sexuality is prohibited. And even worse is this smaller list, but nevertheless shocking list of countries where homosexual acts are punishable with the death penalty. So as I say, there's a huge spread of degrees of tolerance. We know that. And even in my own experience as a teacher, I've come up against the extremes, if you like, because I spent a lot of time teaching in the Middle East, where just recently 17 gay men were imprisoned simply for unfurling rainbow flags at a rock concert in Cairo. Imprisoned for 3 years, I should add. That was part of my experience, and of course it's very different coming to a place like Spain, which is one of the first countries in Europe to legalize same-sex marriage, and where it's not unusual to see, for example, 2 men or 2 women walking hand in hand in the street. So very, very different contexts, and very different, therefore, impact on our lives as language teachers. I think even when, however, when there is a degree of tolerance or legitimacy in a society, that simply often disguises the fact that there's a great deal of prejudice happening. And I'm thinking particularly of bullying. These are figures from Britain, from an organization called the Stonewall Organization, and they're pretty shocking, actually, that 3 in 5 gay pupils experience homophobic bullying. The teachers who witness the bullying never intervene, and only 10% of gay pupils report that teachers challenge homophobic language every time they hear it. So there's a vast underbelly of prejudice and intolerance, even in countries like the UK, where legally, at least, there is a degree of freedom. Here are some more pretty disturbing figures. 96% of gay pupils hear homophobic remarks such as poof or leza used at school. Almost all hear phrases such as "that's so gay" or "you're so gay" in school. And another graph showing the degree that it's considered wrong to bully someone. So if you bully someone for your ethnicity, most schools would say that that is totally wrong, and very few, only 2%, don't rule on that. Likewise, if you have a disability, it's considered wrong to bully somebody. But if you are LGBT+, then there's much less consensus on whether that gives you or not the right to bully someone. So there is, as I say, this kind of ongoing intolerance in mainstream education, at least, of LGBT+ people. Oops, I'll just go back. To focus on our particular area, I think one of the issues, of course, that's been mentioned often in the literature on queering ELT, if you like, is the invisibility of LGBT+ people in materials. And I know that this is a topic that's going to be dealt with later on today, but so I'm not going to deal with it at any length. Just give you a couple of examples. This comes from a lower level course book, vocabulary book, where you can see that there is no representation and no vocabulary to represent same-sex couples. And so it does make a nonsense of the title. I can talk about my family. Certain people can talk about their family, but I certainly couldn't talk about mine using these representations. Of course, you could say, well, now this is beginners, lower level, let's be fair. But if you move up in the series to the intermediate book, where there's a similar unit on families, you'll see that there is, again, no vocabulary offered to talk about same-sex partners, no examples of unorthodox, if you like, family structures. that include at least LGBT plus configurations. Now, I mean, no surprises perhaps, and it goes on. Here's an example of an activity from a course book where people are invited to talk about themselves. So it's a great activity. So you challenge, you say, who are you? And you have to keep answering that question as many ways as possible. And they give some choices here that you could include. I'm an Italian, I'm a daughter, I'm a student, I'm a person who believes in protecting the environment, blah, blah, blah. There's nowhere on that list which allows you to identify yourself as gay, queer, LGBT, or whatever, or even to say that you're in a same-sex relationship. And actually, these are what often has amused me is the way that the imagery or representations, if you like, of same-sex relationships infiltrate into coursebook materials unwittingly. And this is from an old piece of material, one of the first books I ever used, the Building Strategy series, but there's a unit of where two men who share an apartment invite a woman to dinner. And so you have this, I think, rather wonderful photo of Rod and Paul adoringly at Rod while Rod cuts the onions in preparation for the arrival of Rod's girlfriend. I mean, it's not a gay scene, but nevertheless, those of us who are starved of gay or same-sex iconography or representations in course books, this was something you kind of got a pleasure from. And this is another one where, from a 1990s book, where two guys are asking, excuse me, has this town got a hotel with a disco? And I mean, that really is very gay. But of course, again, it's probably accidental or not deliberate. But that's the best you can get in the materials. Things are moving and improving in certain respects. Here is well, I'll come back to that in a second. The other thing is in terms of vocabulary. It's the disempowering nature of the erasure of gayness in vocabulary lists, which I think is also quite shocking, really, given that now we have information about the frequency of a word like gay, which is the 2098th most frequent word in English, according to corpus data, American English at least. And it comes just after Israeli, another actually probably forbidden word in many course books, and just before forever. That is to say that if you're an intermediate student and you're aiming at getting the 2,000 most frequent words of English to give you that kind of coverage of text, you would need to know and recognize and even maybe use the word gay. But does it figure in any vocabulary list that I know of? The Oxford 3000, for example, which is a list which says here the key words that have been selected as words which should receive priority in vocabulary study because of their importance and usefulness. If you look at the Oxford 3000 and you look under G, it's easier to talk about gambling and garbage than it is to identify yourself as gay using this list. So again, there is an enormous amount of, it seems to be persistent invisibility across the board. As I say, things are changing in small steps. Here, for example, some recent material that's published by Pearson, I think, it's a course book, and they have video, YouTube videos that to complement the material, and they're great. They're sort of unscripted interviews with people talking about the things that matter to them. And I think the theme of this one is about happiness. And the question was, when have you been happy this year? And this guy says, yeah, this was the question. What's the best thing that's happened to you this year? And he answers, well, I met my boyfriend. Now it's there. It's unedited. It's uncommented upon, but it's there. And you think, great. And actually, when you go into the YouTube site and look at the comments, then of course we find the kind of things that make your heart sink again. So somebody says, I met my boyfriend, what the fuck? And then another one says, one of them is gay, I guess that's pretty disgusting and disturbing. And blessedly, a girl called Francisca comes to his defense. But I mean, need we be surprised? And I think this is one of the reasons what publishers might say, yes, we don't include this kind of content in our materials because it invites hostility and intolerant statements of a homophobic kind. So there are two issues then, really. There's invisibility on the one hand, and there's hostility or intolerance on the other. And it's arguable that, well, the publishers would argue that it's because of hostility that they avoid any overt LGBT presence in their materials. Where are we going? Oh yes. So I mean, this is of course one of the challenges. It's not just about making LGBT in the materials. It's dealing with the kind of reactions that might elicit, the homophobic comments, etc. And this is, I think, one reason I think many teachers are very nervous about raising any mention, including any inclusivity, if you like, in their content of their lessons. It's interesting, as a footnote, by the way, talking about inclusivity, that the publishers themselves produce guidelines for inclusiveness for writers and illustrators of course books and other materials, which emphasize the importance of not using stereotypical gender roles, making sure that women are portrayed in positions of power, not just caring and sharing kind of professions, that there's ethnic representation, that different religious dresses, etc., included, but there's never a mention of including people who are conspicuously LGBT. And the publishers would argue, well, maybe they don't look any different than normal people anyway. But I think the real agenda here is that they don't want to rock the boat. And it is a dilemma. I mean, it's a dilemma that we as teachers, I'm sure many of you out there have faced, that how do you deal with intolerance when you yourself want to demonstrate tolerant attitudes? Bill Johnston, in an excellent book about values in English language teaching, makes that point. He says that given that for most of us, at least, or many of us, most of our professional morality entails respect for other beliefs and other values, what do we do when faced with values do not include such respect? Can we be tolerant of intolerance? And he adds, this is one of the hardest moral dilemmas faced by language teachers, and it goes to the heart of who we are as teachers. How do we deal? And it's not just LGBT teachers who face this. It's any teacher whose values embrace tolerance of other ethnicities, religions, beliefs, etc., has to deal with how do they deal with intolerance, including homophobia in the classroom. So what I'm going to suggest in the rest of this this introductory talk is I'm going to look at different options that we have, both as teachers and also as a community within the larger teaching community, those of us who are LGBT. And I'm going to suggest that there are certain, as I say, certain strategies or certain options that we can want to look at them in turn. And of course, these are, as I said at the very beginning, are context sensitive. They may not work in the context in which you are in, either because of the age group you're teaching, the institutional constraints under which you're teaching, the community in which you teach, the society, the country that you teach in. Nevertheless, these are the kind of options. Well, the first option is the one that I think most of us at some stage have adopted, which is discretion. To give it a kind word, you could say silence is another way of putting it, or even complicity, because you could argue that silence is complicity, if homophobia is a human rights issue, then should we be silent about it? But I mean, as I say, I was very silent in Egypt when I taught there. I was very discreet, let's say. And I don't think there was any other option for me. So that's probably the default setting. And I think certainly for a lot of non-queer teachers, that's the route that they tend to prefer to take. Then there's what I call normalization, which is would involve, if the publishers would only help, a bit more prominence of same-sex and textbooks, without necessarily making any kind of comment about that, without inviting people to discuss it, but simply including, being more inclusive. I try to do it in some of my own writing, so I always include, if I'm writing a grammar exercise, one in which you've got a sentence like, Ted and Todd went shopping yesterday looking for new furniture. So no comment, but you can make of it what you like. But at least for those students out there who identify as queer, gay, lesbian, or whatever, there's something that they can sort of, somebody's sending this kind of message to them that, yeah, okay, you're not alone. And this goes back to an article I wrote years ago where I begged more representations of LGBT plus people. And as I say, very little seems to have happened in the 20 years since I wrote that article. But normalization would include things like subversion, where teachers design their own materials. Instead of a dialogue where a boy is inviting a girl out over the phone, either degender them, so it's not clear what gender they are by giving them non-gender specific names like Pat and Chris, for example. Or subvert completely and make it a boy inviting a boy out or a girl inviting a girl out and seeing what you can get away with without inviting students to comment, but just saying that's just another kind of relationship, including same-sex partners within a family tree and giving the learners the vocabulary to talk about it. And I think there's always, it seems to me that we're about 50 years behind Hollywood in this respect. And there's a long period where there was gay invisibility in Hollywood movies and film generally, and where things started to change with films like Philadelphia and, of course, more recently, Moonlight and so on. We take heterosexuality for granted, said Russo in his book about Hollywood and LGBT. So the default setting is heterosexuality. Lesbianism and gay male sexuality will give people a shock, a start. They become themes by their very presence. So you can't help but, in a sense, by attempting to normalize LGBT people in course books, of course, it will initially be, as in that example of that video I showed you, the YouTube thing and Speak Out, that they will cause some degree of shock and consternation, but we have to learn to deal with that. And of course, things have changed in society, in many societies, thanks to media, and thanks to Hollywood and the changes that they've experienced there. And of course, thanks to television series like Modern Family, Will and Grace, 6 Feet Under, Queer as Folk, and so on. Yeah, things are changing, but they're not changing in the materials that we have to use. So discretion, normalization, resistance, and that could take many forms. And one is refusing. One might be refusing to use the textbooks that are mandated if that's a viable possibility. Another one for me is a consideration is to refuse to go to countries where LGBT rights are not respected. It's the kind of the boycott sort of position, and it's something that I have not actually explicitly taken, but it does concern me and amuse me to a certain extent with the countries which are most keen for me to visit and give talks and attend conferences are some of the ones which are the most intolerant of the sexuality, of my own sexuality. But that's not an issue necessarily for most practicing teachers. Self-disclosure is another option, and this is a tricky one, of course. Again, it's very, very context sensitive. To what extent do you, when and how do you come out to your learners? And it's one of the hardest things for LGBT people generally in society, because it's very easy, unlike ethnic differences or whatever, it's very easy to remain invisible. I think self-disclosure can be useful, but it can also be very damaging, and it can put the teacher at some considerable risk, for example, within their institution. It can be used in ways which I think are unhelpful. I mean, I have my own story there very early on when I was teaching in Britain, and I had a small group of advanced learners, and we were doing some material which involved discussing I think it was about glam rock. There was a picture of various rock stars, male rock stars wearing makeup, etc. And the students were invited to discuss this. And one of the students said he found it disgusting that men should wear makeup, and he found the whole idea of homosexuality disgusting. And I said, but I felt I knew him well enough, oh, but I'm gay. And he was absolutely mortified. And I think that was a very unfair thing to do, particularly publicly. But I thought, you know, that was a way of winning him over. And I think in retrospect, it was actually the worst possible thing to do. It embarrassed him, embarrassed me, embarrassed everybody. So that's what you shouldn't do. I have a better story is when I was in a teacher training situation in a English-speaking country, trainees from around the world. And we were doing an activity. It was doing that activity I showed you before about identity. You know, who are you? I'm a whatever. I'm from New Zealand. Who are you? I'm a teacher. Who are you? I'm a brother. So on. And I was demonstrating this activity with them. And one of the more forthright women in the group said to me, knowing that I lived in Spain, she said, oh, Scott, do you have a Spanish girlfriend? I have a Swiss boyfriend. And there was a kind of sort of, well, a very positive reaction from the class who wanted to know more. But what was significant was about 2 weeks later, I received an email from one of the few males in that class. And he said to me, that moment when you came out to the class was a watershed moment for me, because I have been struggling to deal with my own sexuality, and that kind of flicked a switch. And he said, you know, I'm really, really grateful that you did that. And so that's the happy side of things. He went on to become and is a teacher and teacher trainer himself, and has his own partner and living very happily in a Latin American country. So there's pluses and minuses to self-disclosure, and you have to do that in your own terms and on your own and take the risks that may be associated with it. Then there's the more overt, deliberate, awareness-raising kinds of activities that you could do. It is not less about normalization. Normalization is, we're not going to talk about it, but we're just going to have representations of LGBT people. Awareness-raising is when you actually raise the issue. And sometimes this, of course, happens involuntarily. These things come up, and they will come up if there are images in the course books, or situations, or relationships, or famous people, or whatever. It's a difficult one, again, whether you want to kind of force this on the students or whether you should let them bubble up naturally. I think there's been a tendency in the last few years to try and include LGBT issues within the umbrella of what are called taboo issues, and sort of deal like abortion or euthanasia or these other issues which have a high ethical content, and to have debates about them, for example. I'm not sure that's always the best policy, and by including LGBT issues within the kind of umbrella of taboo things, you're in a sense maintaining the marginalization of the community. There's a very good blog post in Tyson Seaborn's blog recently about the rights and wrongs of debating about, for example, gay marriage, and I urge you to look at that. And the follow-up discussion has been very interesting. But Tyson is basically very value of putting students in a position of arguing against what is a human right. And one extreme example of that is from Cynthia Nelson's book. I'll give you the reference at the end, where she's collecting anecdotes about teachers and teacher trainers' experiences of critical incidences involving LGBT issues. And she said, she quotes this teacher trainer who says, "The worst hour I ever had in an ESL class was watching a student teacher use a values clarification task in which they have to reach consensus over contentious issues. It was a who lives and who dies sort of thing." So you can imagine it's the kind of like what we call a balloon debate. You've got so many people in a balloon, and the balloon is sinking. Somebody has to be thrown out. And other people in the balloon was a homosexual. And so for an hour, we all sat there while various people from around the world said he should die. It was really horrifying. So this is where awareness raising can be really misdirected and insensitive and inviting intolerance rather than trying to exclude intolerance. So, but there are other things to do other than balloon debates, and I'm sure some of these options will come up in today's discussions. You could argue, as argued by the writers here, that arguing about LGBT issues is good practice in arguing and becoming, as it were, acculturated into the values of the target society, particularly in ESL context. That is, English as a second language context, not EFL context. Now, in an ESL context, the assumption is that a certain amount of integration is going to be needed, and part of the job of the language teacher is to lubricate that integration through engaging in the kinds of discourses, particularly at an academic level for academically minded learners. And so these writers say, in ESL context, the fact that discussing lesbian and queer themes can be complex culturally is precisely why doing so can be productive pedagogically. Complexity is a good thing to be engaging with. It's not productive in the sense of furthering a gay agenda or a campaign for gay rights. That's not the point. But in terms of enhancing the ability to understand, participate in, and negotiate discursive practices. So that's the argument. It's not about changing people's attitudes. It's about training people to engage in this kind of level of discussion, which is not all about, it's not hate talk, as it were. Now, but again, it's how you do this. It has to be done with a great deal of sensitivity and forethought and authenticity too on the part of the teacher. Recognizing that for many learners these topics will be extremely uncomfortable, but also recognizing that amongst the classroom there may be learners who are, as in the case of who are hiding their sexuality, but maybe may welcome the opportunity to come out, as it were. And then a further strategy response is activism, I guess, in all its different forms. And I think what we're doing today, in a sense, is a kind of activism. It's really putting it on the agenda, but I think there's things that could also be done which are even more challenging to the status quo. I would love to see some kind of, I don't know, advocacy directed at publishers, particularly given the problems of invisibility, petitions or whatever, letters of protest, etc., to try and push the publishers in the direction of more inclusiveness. And then finally, research is an option too, and finding out, asking the questions, finding out what people think. We tend to make a lot of assumptions, but do we really know, for example, what the learners think about these kinds of issues? There was a lovely study done recently in Japan by a teacher who asked her students, and she asked teachers in her institution what their reaction would be to including more what she called gender and sexuality issues. And what she found, interestingly enough, amongst these secondary school and college students in Japan, that the students were quite happy with the idea of engaging with these issues. It was the teachers who were less keen to use these topics in their language classrooms. And one of the reasons, which I've already mentioned, is I think because they were afraid, or they are afraid, homophobic comments, etc., won't know necessarily how to deal with them. So again, a measure of teacher training perhaps is necessary for all teachers, not just non-LGBT teachers. But I think we all need to work out what strategies are appropriate for dealing with homophobic comments. But I think what's encouraging about this study, very small scale study, but that it's learners who are perfectly comfortable for all these cultural, social reasons, I think, media reasons, etc., that I've mentioned. That things are changing out there. They're not perhaps changing fast enough in the classroom. So a couple of books I've mentioned already. Cynthia Nelson's book on sexual identities in the English language. That's where she interviewed lots and lots of teachers and students and got some really interesting stories. And the material in there is very good for awareness raising, some of the stories that she collected of prejudice or whatever, or not necessarily always negative stories. And I think one of the things that we can do as a community is share the positive stories. I've been to one too many sessions at TESOL, for example, where people sit around and actually start weeping because of things that their students have said to them, and they're sharing this in a kind of, well, you know, fine, but I think we need to hear some more positive stories as well. And we need to collect these and share them. And there are a number in this book. And then on the language aspect of sexuality, then this book by Deborah Cameron and Don Kulik is very good if you're interested in the sort of linguistic side of language about not specifically gender but sexuality. Then that's a excellent book. And a couple of articles, including the one that I wrote about gay invisibility in the EFL subculture, which I think is available on my website. And some organizations that I've mentioned, the Stonewall organization, with the British branch of that, which supplied that information about bullying, and the ILGA website, which has a lot of data about human rights around the world. And I showed you the map at the beginning there. And then there, specifically in ESOL in Britain, there last year where a series of seminars were run dealing with exactly this issue in the ESOL context. And I think that website provides some of the materials that were produced. So on that note, folks, I'm going to rejoin you. And Bruno, hang on.
Yes. Are you done?
Can you see?
Yes.
I'm done.
Yeah, wonderful. Let me see if people have questions for you. So guys, we are ready for your questions. Anyone would like to ask Scott a question?
Questions or comments, I mean.
Yeah, questions or comments.
I don't know how many.
At the moment, we have 23 people live watching us.
Wow, that's fantastic.
Yeah. Let's see.
And I hope.
Well, there is a question here. It's not exactly a question, it's a comment by Vanya saying that when you were talking about LGBT plus representation in course books, that apart from the fact that nobody's divorced, no one has step parents or mixed race families. So that's
Yes, it's not
a lot of
just,
people are invisible when it comes to course books.
yes, and again, I think it's probably motivated by similar reasons, not wanting to cause unnecessary bad vibes on the part of students, etc., and also sensitive to countries around the world where some of these kinds of relationships, situations are not recognized, even like divorce, for example. And I know that the publishers will often argue, individual people in publishing, and say, "Oh no, I'm very, very pro including more images of different kinds of relationships, but we have to sell our books in," and then they name a country that would not be tolerated. And so, you know, you can see that there's a merchandising kind of a mercenary argument here, but I think there are ways around that. And what's interesting actually is if you look at books that are published for specific markets or for ESL purposes, you'll find a much greater degree of inclusivity in those kinds of books which are printed in the States for use in the States, as opposed to books that are printed in the States for use in Indonesia.
We have another question from Sergio Scott. He wants to know what was the most remarkable experience with students coming out for you, like during classes?
For me?
Yeah.
Remarkable, positive or negative?
Well, up to you.
Well, I mean, I've told you the negative, and I think that made me very wary. And of course, all the time that I was teaching in Egypt, there was never any mention ever of sexuality, either mine or anybody's. Subsequently, I'm trying to think of, I mean, again, even when I moved to Spain, I was circumspect, let's say. I mean, there's always the danger that it seems to me that there's a fine line between including more LGBT content in classrooms and on the one hand, and on the other hand, being accused of promoting the famous gay agenda. Any kind of proselytizing or preaching or whatever, to me, seems to me out of bounds in classrooms. But that doesn't mean to say that we don't also have a responsibility as educators, because that's what we are, to move people along a little bit, to open their minds. And is a good way of doing that, because language teaching presupposes, in a sense, a kind of different culture, although it's arguable that there is an English culture, of course, now anymore. But nevertheless, language does give people the opportunity to perhaps re-present themselves or re-identify or identify differently. And I think we need more needs to be done in terms of exploring how this could be achieved. I mean, there's been some interesting research or papers written about, for example, a group of Korean gay men who were learning English and actually used English as a kind of lingua franca because they felt they had more freedom to express their identities in English than they did in Korean. This is way off the subject of your question, but I'm sort of thinking back now, thinking that perhaps I was unnecessarily cautious in a lot of my teaching, not so much my teacher training. and that if I were to do it all over again, that perhaps I would make a more determined effort to normalize LGBT representations in materials, and also maybe to attempt to do activities which did raise awareness about some of these issues in the context of human rights, for example.
Yeah, coming back to what you said about the Korean guys, it reminded me of something that happened to me this week, I guess. A private student I have, he was talking about his private life. He was talking about his sexuality in English. It was a conversation class. And after the class, he said, Bruno, I feel much more comfortable talking about my sexuality, my identity in English than I do in Portuguese. How do you
I think that's well attested. Exactly. Actually, while you were saying that, Bruno, I just remember my other, I suppose, critical incidents in my classroom experience have actually happened as a student. So in studying Spanish here in Spain, it's often the case that when of course, it doesn't happen in English so much, but when you're corrected, so somebody's asking you about your family life, and I say, well, me and mi novio, my boyfriend, and the teacher automatically corrects it to mi novia. And I say, no, no, no. And they're kind of quick here now, because awareness is such that they'll say, okay, I get it, I get it, I get it. So there's often the case that people don't recognize whether it's a gender mistake, like a linguistic mistake, or it's the fact of the matter. And I think those are interesting incidents, both for teachers and for students and for other students in the class, because the teacher's response is critical there. The teacher is perfectly comfortable with that, and even perhaps apologizes for, oh, I'm sorry, I thought it was a linguistic thing. Then it creates a freer space for people to express themselves and not have to invent a family that they don't have.
Yeah, that's so true. Let's see if we have more questions. Anyone? Sergio, Renan, Vanius. Still have some time for questions. Let's see if someone asks a question. Scott, just a second.
This will be available on YouTube, is that right?
Yeah. Yes.
Like I say, those.
Go ahead.
If anybody needs the references, then they will be there at the end of the YouTube video.
Yeah. Someone asked if you have ever had a gay couple in class.
Well, not that I know of. Not in my ELT classes, or nor in my teacher training, actually. What seems to be happening increasingly, talking to colleagues of mine, is that there's a greater visibility of transsexuals in classes, and which again creates a challenge, not least linguistically, in terms of the pronouns and everything. But this seems to be very much a kind of subcategory within the broader debate about LGBT.
But even when talking about trans people, if they are part of a class, does it happen that they are discriminated or included by the other students? What's your take on that?
Well, I mean, this is going to depend completely on the different contexts in that. And I think that in a country like Spain, and I hope Brazil, that people would not be that phased. But I can think of other contexts which would be very difficult. And this is where the teacher's role again is absolutely critical, that person must be accepted into the small society or community, which is the class, and that the teacher is the person who will in a sense, invite them in and make it and normalize the situation as quickly as possible.
Yeah. Make it seemingly, right? It's just natural. Don't make it a big deal of it.
Exactly. And this is where this thing about authenticity is so important, that we need to be authentic human beings in the classroom and not always pretending that we are just pedagogues or technicians or whatever, which is where a climate, a classroom dynamic which is supportive generally of everybody, not of intolerance, needs to be established. And now whether that needs to be made explicit, whether you should have ground rules, for example, which everybody agrees to. Again, that's going to depend on the age of the students, their needs, etc., their motivations, and the context. But coming back to your original question about gay couples in the class, I've always been interested in these initiatives that pop up from time to time around the world. There was one in Buenos Aires and another one in Dublin, I think, of schools which cater solely for LGBT people. And so their classes are constituted where the teachers are presumably gay, and the students elect that school.
For gay people or transgender people.
Because I think that would be kind of interesting. I'm not sure if I'm 100% in agreement with the idea of kind of ghettoization of ELT, but if people feel more comfortable in that context, then fine. I also would be really interested to know what the materials they are, what they use, and the whole nature of the classroom interaction, I think, would be a very interesting thing to study, apart from anything else, and whether that makes for a better learning environment than one which is more heterogeneous.
There's another question, Scott, from Drico. He wants to know if you have ever been in a situation where you thought hiding your sexuality would be the best strategy, because he says that a great part of his income comes from teaching English to mechanical engineers. So there's this whole male-centered, straightforward, straight-oriented culture, and he never considers open his sexuality to this kind of people. So how should we deal with that?
Yeah, no, I mean, again, it's all about the context, and I think don't make life more difficult for yourself than it is. Teaching is difficult at the best of times, and occasionally I've had negative reactions, not from classrooms, but from in professional contexts where I've sort of let it slip that I'm gay, and there's been suddenly people change their attitude. And there was one incident where I suddenly became a persona non grata for a particular publisher and his son, in fact, who refused to speak to me thereafter. So, really? But you live with it. I mean, it was only for a weekend. It was for a conference, and that's their problem, not my problem. They overheard me talking to somebody in the cafeteria during the conference, and who had asked me about my whether I was married or not, and I said no, but I live with them. And they overheard, and these were publishers who were hosting me at this conference, and they became very unhospitable thereafter. So,
yeah, this is also a question from Thomas. Have you ever been requested by superiors to lay low? So that's exactly the example you're saying.
And I suspect that this video, if it goes out, if people watch it in parts of the world where they don't know about me, that it might prejudice my chances of being invited there. But I mean, I'm old enough now not to let that worry me.
Yeah,
There's enough other places in the world to go to.
It's a big role in this kind of situations, right? Let me ask you another question. Renan wants to know if you have any kind of advice for teachers who work for those very traditional institutions where they simply can't tackle those issues, but have LGBTQ students who want to be acknowledged.
Yeah, well, again, I don't think tackling the issues is people shouldn't feel guilty about not tackling the issues, because there's very good reasons not to tackle not just LGBT issues, but we don't talk about other things perhaps which are highly sensitive, like religion or politics or race or whatever. In some contexts, it's simply not appropriate. It won't work. It will just make everybody uncomfortable, etc. I think the kind of where it's possible to, I mean, that the normalization route is the one I would suggest, where you can somehow slip things in to the materials in that, so that nothing may happen. But on the other hand, somebody might ask a question and say, but hang on, these are two men going shopping together. And then you could gently ask questions like, well, do you think that's a problem? Or a picture of two women holding hands, for example. What do you think their relationship is then? You know, what could it be? But it's all about being very sensitive, and it's also about being, as I said in the abstract, it's about being a good teacher and a good example to your students. And the better the teacher you are, and the better the professional, the more I think learners will give you a bit of the benefit of the doubt, or they will be less critical or less hostile even, because they know that you are a good educationist fundamentally, and that you are also, that you have your own values and beliefs, but you're not necessarily going to force them onto the students. But if things come up, you will deal with them in a sensitive and an authentic way.
Yeah. Caroline wants to know if you think that gay men are better accepted in the ELT industry rather than gay women.
If I think they are what?
Knows very few gay women in the industry, so.
Well, I wouldn't want to. I mean, I think there's probably in teaching, as in other related professions that are so-called caring, there is a greater proportion of LGBT people generally, in my experience at least. And in fact, I have to say that I've never ever encountered within the organizations I've worked for, I've never encountered anything remotely like prejudice. But there's been a number of other out gay men and women that I've worked with. It's never, ever, ever been a problem, but I've been very lucky, perhaps, in that respect. But there is a, you know, and you'd be surprised, and I think a number of the people watching would be surprised how many important figures in our field are LGBT, although they haven't necessarily made it explicit. It's difficult to draw any conclusions when a lot of people working in the field are not out, as it were, professionally, although we may know that in their private lives they are. Really are.
Okay, Scott, so that's it. We're done with the questions. Thank you very much for the presentation. It was wonderful. It was such an honor to have you on board this project. We would like to thank you so much. And that's it. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you, Bruno. Thank you. And I look forward to attending some of the subsequent sessions today and or watching them on YouTube. But once again, thank you for giving me this opportunity, and good luck with the rest of the day.
Thank you, Scott. Bye-bye.
Bye, everyone.